Welcome to our deep dive today into Mark Manson's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. We're going to be looking at some excerpts that you sent in and, yeah, trying to figure out how to determine which values are actually worth our energy. Are you ready?
Absolutely. I think this is going to be a really interesting one. We'll be trying to give you Manson's tools to identify your values and if they're actually serving you, and how to pick better ones.
Sounds good to me. Okay, so Manson kind of starts off with this guy, Charles Bukowski, this writer who was, to put it lightly, a bit of a mess.
He was, really. Bukowski was an alcoholic, a gambler. You name it, his lifestyle was pretty rough. And on top of all that, his writing was rejected for decades. Really just the opposite of what we would think of as someone successful.
Right. But here's the thing. He eventually found success not by conforming to those expectations, but by embracing his flaws and writing honestly about them.
Exactly. And that's kind of the first point here that Manson's trying to make.
Yeah.
Vygotsky's success really shows this core idea of the book, that the pressure to be positive can actually backfire. We're constantly bombarded with messages that tell us to be happier, healthier, richer, all this stuff. I mean, do you feel that pressure sometimes?
Oh, yeah. All the time. I mean, especially with social media these days. You see these picture-perfect lives, and it's easy to feel inadequate about your own.
Totally. And that's exactly what Manson calls the feedback loop from hell. You feel bad about not being happy enough, which only makes you feel worse. It's just this downward spiral.
So how do we break free from that? I mean, is it really about becoming totally indifferent to everything? Because honestly, that doesn't sound very appealing.
Yeah, that's where the title can be a little misleading. Not giving a fuck isn't about being apathetic. It's more about being selective with our energy.
Yeah.
Think of it like this. Imagine someone yelling at a cashier over like a 30-cent coupon. They give a fuck about that because you know in that moment it's the biggest problem in their world.
Okay, so it's about perspective then.
Yeah.
But how do we figure out what actually deserves our attention and what we can just let go of?
Right, and that's where defining your values comes in. You have to give a fuck about something bigger, so you cannot give a fuck about the smaller things. Manson actually tells this story about a prince who sought enlightenment by experiencing both extreme pleasure and extreme suffering.
So he basically went from like a life of luxury to a life of poverty, thinking that would bring him enlightenment.
Yeah, and you know what? Neither one did. Which I think highlights this idea that it's not about avoiding discomfort entirely, it's about choosing your struggles, finding the discomfort that aligns with your values and leads to growth. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's easy to go into the trap of thinking happiness means avoiding all discomfort, but maybe it's more about finding the kind that helps us grow.
Absolutely. And to find the right kind of discomfort, we need to understand what we truly value, because ultimately our values determine how we see problems and how we experience happiness.
So speaking of values, Manson introduces this character called Disappointment Panda, who basically goes around telling people hard truths.
Oh, disappointment panda. He's hilarious, but he makes a good point. We all need a dose of reality sometimes to snap us out of our delusions. It's so easy to just buy into societal expectations without ever really questioning them. What do you think about that?
I think Disappointment Panda is onto something there. Sometimes we really do need to confront those hard truths and figure out what we actually value. That brings us to one of Manson's big ideas, practical enlightenment.
I like the sound of that. But to be honest, when I hear the word enlightenment, I picture like monks meditating on mountaintops. What does practical enlightenment actually look like?
It's not about achieving some kind of mystical bliss. It's about being grounded in reality, accepting that there's good and bad and finding meaning in it all. Manson argues that problems are inevitable and that happiness comes from solving them. So it's not about avoiding problems, but about choosing the right ones to tackle.
Exactly. And to choose the right problems, you need to identify and reframe your values. He uses this example of Pete Best, the drummer, who was fired from the Beatles right before they hit it big.
Oh yeah, the so-called fifth Beatle. I can't imagine how crushing that must have been for him.
Yeah, it was a huge setback. And at first, Best really saw it as this massive failure. But here's the interesting thing. He eventually found happiness and fulfillment through other things, family, stability, personal growth. He redefined what success meant to him.
So if he had clung to that value of rock star fame, he probably would have stayed miserable.
Mm-hmm.
But by shifting his values, he opened himself up to a different kind of fulfillment. So how do we actually figure out what we value?
Well, Manson suggests asking yourself a series of why questions. For example, let's say you feel like a failure because you aren't close with your brother. Instead of dwelling on that feeling, dig deeper. Ask yourself, why does it bother me that we're not close?
So it's about getting to the root of the issue, understanding the motivation behind our feelings.
Right. Maybe you realize that closeness, how you've defined it, frequent calls, doing things together, isn't actually the most important thing. Maybe you value things like mutual respect and trust more, or just having shared values. By questioning those metrics, you get a deeper understanding of what truly matters.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion to get to the core of what's driving us. But once we've identified our values, how do we know if they're good ones or if they're just setting us up for disappointment?
That's a great question. Manson actually goes into the different categories of values and their potential downsides. For example, he warns against placing too much emphasis on fleeting values like pleasure.
Yeah, I mean, a sugar rush is great in the moment, but it doesn't really last.
Exactly. And he also talks about the danger of overvaluing material success. Sure, we all need money to survive, but past a certain point, more money doesn't necessarily equal more happiness.
So it's not about rejecting wealth altogether, but about recognizing that it's not the end-all be-all.
You know what really stuck out to me was his point that lasting happiness often comes from values that involve inherent challenges and growth.
Oh, absolutely. Think about things like raising a child or starting a business or pursuing a creative passion. These things push you outside your comfort zone and force you to grow.
It's about finding those activities that make you feel truly alive, even if they come with struggles. But I think a lot of people struggle with this whole idea of choosing your problems. It just feels so counterintuitive. Why would anyone actively seek out challenges?
That's where Manson brings in this idea of taking responsibility for your problems. And I know that this could be a tough one because it's easy to confuse responsibility with fault.
Yeah, especially when things happen that feel totally out of our control. It's hard to take responsibility when you feel like something was done to you. Oh, for sure. But Manson is very clear that taking responsibility doesn't mean blaming yourself. It's about recognizing that even when something's not your fault, you still have a choice in how you respond and what you learn from it. He uses this really interesting example of William James, who's considered the father of American psychology.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of him. What's his story?
So Jim actually suffered from debilitating health problems and early career failures to the point where he even contemplated suicide. But then he decided to try this experiment. For 1 year, he would act as if he were 100% responsible for everything that happened in his life, no matter what.
Wow, that's a pretty radical approach. So he basically decided to take ownership of his life, even the parts that felt totally outside his control.
Exactly. And the results were kind of incredible. He went on to have a really successful career and family life. He even attributed his transformation to this shift in perspective.
So even though he couldn't control everything that happened to him, he could control his attitude and his choices. And that made a huge difference.
It really did. Taking responsibility empowers us to focus on what we can control, even in the face of really difficult circumstances. It helps us break free from that feeling of being a victim.
That makes sense. If you feel like your problems are being forced upon you, you're just going to feel helpless. But if you feel like you're choosing them, even if they're hard, you have more control.
Exactly. And this leads us to another really important part of Manson's philosophy, the importance of saying no. It's something that so many people struggle with.
Oh, tell me about it. It's so easy to get caught up in trying to please everyone and saying yes to everything.
It's a common trap, but it can lead to burnout and even resentment. Manson argues that saying no is essential for defining our values and creating a meaningful life. He actually uses his own experience with travel as an example.
That's interesting because you'd think traveling the world would be all about freedom and possibilities, but even that can become overwhelming if you're not careful. What did he learn from all that travel?
Well, initially, he was driven by this desire for adventure and novelty. But over time, he realized that constantly chasing new experiences led to diminishing returns.
It's like that been there, done that feeling. You can only see so many beaches or eat so many exotic foods before it starts to feel kind of empty.
Right. And he eventually understood that true meaning comes from depth of experience, from investing in things that truly matter to us. And that often means saying no to distractions that pull us away from what's important. He even talked about his time living in Russia, where the culture is known for being very blunt and honest. At first, it was jarring for him because he was used to a more indirect communication style.
I can relate to that. Different cultures have very different ways of communicating,
Yeah.
and it definitely takes some adjusting. What did he take away from that experience? So he was kind of thrown off by the directness at first, but it sounds like he came to appreciate it. What did he take away from that whole experience?
Well, he realized that this blunt honesty, even though it was uncomfortable at times, actually created this deeper trust and connection. It's about being upfront about your needs and boundaries and being okay with hearing no from other people.
So it's not about being rude, but about being authentic, even if it means having some tough conversations.
Exactly. And that kind of ties into this whole idea of saying no in relationships. Manson actually contrasts this idea of romanticized love like Romeo and Juliet with a more practical understanding of it.
Okay, now I'm really curious. How does Romeo and Juliet play into all this? I mean, isn't that supposed to be like the ultimate love story?
Well, it's often portrayed that way, but when you really look at it, it's a pretty messed up relationship. They're driven by these super intense emotions that ultimately lead to their destruction.
Oh, I see. So it's kind of a cautionary tale about romanticizing these unhealthy relationships.
Right. And Manson really emphasizes that healthy love is actually built on mutual respect, having clear boundaries, and being able to give and receive rejection. It's about choosing someone who supports you and challenges you to grow, not someone who's supposed to complete you or fix all your problems. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it's really easy to fall into that trap of looking for someone to complete us. But that almost always leads to disappointment. A healthy relationship should be about two whole people coming together.
Exactly. And that brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, death. I know this might sound kind of heavy, but Manson argues that facing our mortality can actually be incredibly liberating.
Okay, that took a bit of an unexpected turn. I'm definitely intrigued, but maybe a little apprehensive. How does death fit into all of this?
It's not about being morbid or dwelling on the negative. It's more about using that awareness of our own mortality to help us clarify what truly matters. Remember that story he shared about sitting on the edge of a cliff?
Oh, yeah, it sounded terrifying, but also kind of exhilarating in a weird way.
Exactly. He uses that to illustrate the idea that facing our fears, even the fear of death, can help us break free from all the things that are holding us back.
So it's like recognizing that our time is limited and making choices that reflect what we really value instead of getting caught up in all the things that don't.
Exactly. And by contemplating our own mortality, we can let go of that need for external validation, the fear of failure, that constant pressure to be perfect. We can focus on the things that actually bring us joy.
So it's not about avoiding death, but about using it as a lens to help us focus on what's important.
Absolutely. And that's ultimately what Manson means by not giving a fuck. It's about choosing your values wisely, accepting the things you can't control, and focusing on what truly matters, knowing that, our time here is limited.
This has been a really interesting deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground today, from understanding our values and choosing our struggles to taking responsibility and facing our fears.
I hope this gave you some things to think about and some tools to start living a life that's more true to yourself.
And remember, it's not about achieving some perfect state of enlightenment. It's about embracing the journey with all of its ups and downs.
It's about being authentically you.
Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep giving those fucks where they really count.
Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be exploring something kind of different, I guess you could say.
Different good.
Yeah, different good. I hope so, at least. I mean, the topic is really fascinating. It all started with some excerpts that you sent in from Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, The Serviceberry Abundance and Reciprocity in the Natural World. Have you read this one yet?
Oh yeah, I love Kimber's work. She has such a beautiful way of weaving together science and storytelling, indigenous knowledge and personal reflection.
I totally agree. And in this piece about service berries, she kind of blew my mind with this idea of a service berry economy.
It's a really thought-provoking concept, right?
Yeah.
Like, who would have thought that a simple berry could hold the key to understanding alternative economic systems?
Right. It's not just about economics, though, is it? It's like a whole philosophy of living a way of being in the world. And she starts by talking about something I think a lot of us can relate to, that joy of picking Saskatoon service berries. That feeling of abundance, like you're receiving a pure gift from nature.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, just the taste alone is like a little burst of sunshine. But it's more than that. It's that feeling of connection to the land, to the seasons, to something bigger than yourself.
It reminds me of when I was a kid and we used to go blackberry picking with my grandma. We'd come home with buckets full of berries, and it felt like we'd struck gold. It wasn't just about the berries themselves. It was about that shared experience, that feeling of abundance and gratitude.
And Kimmerer talks about how service berries have all these different names, too. Saskatoon, Juneberry, Shadbush. It just shows how important they've been across cultures and throughout history.
And they weren't just a tasty snack. They were actually a vital food source for Indigenous peoples, right? Especially as a key ingredient in pemmican, which helped them survive harsh winters. It's amazing how these little berries played such a significant role.
Exactly. It's a reminder that our relationship with food goes way beyond just what we put on our plates.
Yeah.
It's about culture history, connection to the land.
Okay, so we have this delicious, nutritious berry with a rich history, and Kimmerer uses it as a model for this gift economy. I'll be honest, when I first heard that term, I was a little skeptical. Like, it sounds nice in theory, but does it really work in the real world?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Oh, huh?
But Kimmerer makes a compelling case. She argues that the Serviceberry itself embodies the principles of the gift economy.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break it down for me. How does a berry demonstrate an economic system?
Well, think about it. The serviceberry offers its blossoms to pollinators, its fruit to birds and animals. It even partners with underground fungal networks to share nutrients. It thrives because of this interconnectedness, this generosity. And that's what a gift economy is all about: goods and services, circulating freely, fostering relationships, strengthening the community as a whole.
So it's not about immediate payback or profit. It's about creating this web of reciprocity where everyone benefits in the long run.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that our well-being is intertwined with the well-being of others and the well-being of the planet.
You know, it makes me think about those little free libraries that are popping up everywhere, or that time my neighbor brought over a basket of zucchini from their garden. Are those like small-scale examples of gift economies in action?
Absolutely. You see it all the time: sharing home-cooked meals, lending tools, helping a friend move. These are all microcosms of gift economies where the focus is on connection and community, not just transaction.
It's a refreshing contrast to that buy-sell every interaction is a transaction mindset that we're so used to.
It is. It's like we've forgotten that there's another way of being in the world, a way that's based on generosity and trust.
And Kimmerer tells this amazing story about a Brazilian hunter who says he stores his meat in the belly of his brother. It's such a powerful image of how gift economies work.
It challenges our whole notion of wealth, doesn't it? In a gift economy, wealth isn't about individual accumulation. It's about the collective well-being of the community.
It's like that saying, a rising tide lifts all boats. But I can't help but think about the tragedy of the commons argument. Doesn't that kind of blow this whole gift economy idea out of the water?
That's a common critique, for sure.
Yeah.
But Kimmerer brings up Elinor Ostrom's work. Remember, she won a Nobel Prize for showing that communities can successfully manage shared resources without resorting to privatization.
Oh, right. I'd forgotten about that. So it is possible to have shared resources without everyone just exploiting them until they're gone.
Exactly. There are countless examples throughout history and across cultures of communities sustainably managing forests, fisheries, water systems. It's not a utopian fantasy. It's a proven reality.
Okay, so there's hope.
Yeah.
Then I'm also thinking about that dish with one spoon treaty that Kimmerer mentions. That agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations, it sounds like a beautiful model for how to approach shared resources with responsibility and respect.
It is. It emphasizes the idea of collective stewardship, recognizing that we all share this land and its resources, and we need to take care of them together.
But then she brings up this story about the master gardener's free farm stand being robbed. It just breaks your heart. You know, you have these people giving so generously, and then someone comes along and takes advantage of their kindness.
It's a stark reminder that trust is essential in a gift economy, and that there will always be those who might try to exploit that trust. It's not a perfect system, but I don't think that negates its value.
So where do we go from here? How do we learn from both the successes and the challenges of gift economies and figure out how to apply these principles to our own lives?
Well, one way is to look to nature as our guide. Think about the serviceberry. It thrives because it gives freely. Maybe that's a lesson we can all learn.
That's a beautiful thought. It feels like we're at a crossroads here. Do we continue down this path of every man for himself, or do we embrace a more Serviceberry-like approach?
That's the question we're all grappling with, and it's not an easy one to answer. But maybe by exploring these ideas, by looking at the examples of gift economies in action, we can start to imagine a different way of being in the world. A world where generosity and reciprocity are the norm rather than the exception.
I love that I'm ready to dive deeper into those possibilities. Are you?
Absolutely. Let's keep exploring.
Yeah. That Brazilian hunter storing his meat in the belly of his brother, it's such a powerful image. It really makes you think differently about wealth.
It does. It challenges that whole idea that wealth is just about how much stuff you can accumulate, you know?
Right. It's about taking care of each other.
Exactly. And Kimmerer talks about how that kind of thinking, that generosity, is really at the heart of a gift economy.
But, okay, let's be real for a second. How do we actually bridge that gap? You know, how do we bring those Serviceberry values into our modern world? It seems like a huge leap.
Yeah, it's definitely not easy.
Yeah.
But I think Kimmerer gives us some really good places to start.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, she talks about the importance of community. right? Like those small-scale examples we were talking about before. The little free libraries, the neighbors sharing their zucchini.
Right, those are great, but they're pretty small scale.
They are, but I think they show us that these principles can work even in a modern context.
Hmm.
It's about shifting our mindset away from that hyper-individualism that's so prevalent in our society.
So it's about recognizing that we're all interconnected, that we need each other.
Exactly. And that our well-being is tied to the well-being of our communities.
And she talks about the Nordic model too, right? Those cuddly capitalists, as she calls them.
Yeah, she loves that phrase.
Yeah.
And I think it's really apt. They've managed to create societies that are both economically prosperous and socially just.
They have higher taxes than we do, but they also have universal healthcare-free education, a strong social safety net.
And they consistently rank among the happiest countries in the world.
So it is possible to have a system that prioritizes both people and profit.
I think so. It's about finding that balance.
Mhm.
It's not about one or the other, it's about both.
I like that.
Yeah.
It makes me think about those intentional communities that are popping up all over the place. People are choosing to live in ways that are more aligned with their values, more sustainable, more community-oriented.
Right. It's about creating those webs of reciprocity that we were talking about before. It's about choosing to live in a way that benefits everyone, not just ourselves.
But can those small-scale efforts really make a difference in the face of all the huge problems we're facing? Climate change, economic inequality.
I think they can. I mean, I think about it. Every movement starts small, right?
Okay.
It's about planting those seeds and watching them grow. It's about changing the conversation, shifting the narrative.
So it's not about giving up on the world as it is. It's about imagining something better and then taking steps to make that vision a reality.
Exactly. And Kimmer reminds us that we're not starting from scratch. There's so many people and organizations out there who are already doing amazing work. She talks about Kate Raworth and her donut economics model.
I've heard of that. It's about creating an economy that operates within the limits of the planet, right?
Yeah, she talks about the need to stay within the ecological ceiling while also ensuring that everyone has access to the resources they need to thrive. It's about finding that sweet spot where we're meeting everyone's needs without overshooting the planet's capacity.
It's a beautiful idea. I just hope we can actually make it happen.
Me too. But I think Kimmer is right when she says that we're in a moment of profound possibility. Things are changing, whether we like it or not. And we have a choice to make. Do we want to cling to the old ways of doing things, or do we want to create something new, something better?
It's a daunting task, but it's also incredibly exciting.
It is. And I think it's important to remember that we're not alone in this. There are so many people out there who are working towards a more just and sustainable world.
And every little bit helps.
Exactly. Every act of kindness, every decision we make to align our lives with our values, it all adds up.
So what's the next step? Where do we go from here?
Well, I think Kimmer would say that the next step is to ask ourselves how we can be good medicine for the world. How can we each contribute to the healing and the flourishing of our communities and the planet?
It's one thing to talk about these big ideas like gift economies and Serviceberry values, but it's another thing to actually see them in action.
Totally. And that's what I love about the last part of Kimmer's book. She introduces us to these real people who are actually living these principles,
Yeah, like who?
Well, there's Paulie, for example. He runs this amazing farm.
Paulie's Farm.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a for-profit business, right? But he's also deeply committed to community and reciprocity.
So it's not like he's rejecting capitalism altogether.
No, not at all. It's more like he's finding ways to weave those Serviceberry values into the way he does business.
So like what kind of things does he do?
Well, for one thing, he's really focused on building relationships with his customers, with his employees, with his community as a whole.
So it's not just about the bottom line.
Right. It's about recognizing that his success is intertwined with the well-being of everyone around him.
That's so cool. And it makes me think about that story about the Eagle Scout who rebuilt the free farm stand after it was robbed.
Oh, yeah. That's such a powerful example.
Yeah.
It's like this kid just embodies the spirit of the Serviceberry. He saw a need and he stepped up to fill it. He didn't wait for someone else to do it.
It gives me hope.
Yeah.
It shows that even small acts of kindness can make a big difference.
Absolutely. And it reminds me of something Kimmerer says in the book. She talks about how we can all be good medicine for the world.
What does she mean by that?
Well, I think she's saying that we all have something to offer. We all have gifts that we can share with others.
Yeah.
We can all contribute to the healing and the flourishing of our communities and the planet.
It's a beautiful thought. It makes me wonder, are there any bigger picture examples of this kind of thinking, beyond these individual acts of kindness.
Oh, yeah, definitely. She talks about Kate Raworth and her donut economics model.
Donut economics. I love that name. What's that all about?
Well, it's basically a framework for creating an economy that operates within the limits of the planet.
So like sustainable development.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot where we're meeting everyone's needs without overshooting the Earth's capacity.
I like that. It sounds like a pretty ambitious goal, though.
It is, but I think it's an important one. And she's not the only one who's thinking along these lines. Kimmerer also mentions Catherine Collins, who's all about regenerative investing.
Regenerative investing. What's that?
Well, it's basically about investing in ways that heal and restore rather than extract and exploit.
So like putting your money where your values are.
Exactly. It's about using finance as a force for good.
These are some really big ideas. It's kind of overwhelming to think about how we actually put them into practice on a large scale.
I know it can feel that way, but I think Kimmerer would remind us that every journey starts with a single step.
So it's not about trying to solve all the world's problems at once.
Right. It's about focusing on what we can do in our own lives, in our own communities. It's about making those small changes, those everyday choices that add up to something bigger.
Like choosing to buy from local businesses.
Yeah, or supporting organizations that are working to make a difference, or simply being kind to each other.
It's about remembering that we're all in this together.
Exactly. And that even though things might seem tough right now, there's still hope.
There's still a chance to create a better world.
Absolutely. And I think that's the ultimate message of the Serviceberry economy.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that all flourishing is mutual, that we thrive when we take care of each other, when we share our gifts freely, when we recognize our interconnectedness.
It's a beautiful message, and it's a powerful call to action. So what do you say we all go out there and plant some Serviceberry seeds?
I'm in. Let's do it.
Thanks for joining us on this depth dive into the Serviceberry economy, and may we all find ways to bring a little more abundance and reciprocity into our lives and our communities.